Hello and welcome to this episode of Epochs, where I shall be continuing my discussion of the life and career of Crassus and the extended narrative of the decline and fall of the Roman Republic. Now, last time I left off with Crassus and Pompey finishing up the Third Servile War, which was the war with Spartacus. Now, more or less straight after that period, both Pompey and Crassus ran for and won a consulship. So as everyone knows, there's two consuls in Rome at any given time. But Crassus and Pompey just didn't get on together politically in this first joint consulship. Plutarch says, these friendly relations, however, were not maintained once they came into office. In fact, they differed on practically every point that came up. They were constantly quarrelling, each trying to get the better of the other, and as a result, they made themselves as consuls politically ineffective and achieved nothing. End quote. After that, Crassus goes on to be censor, and Plutarch tells us that again he accomplished literally nothing at all. One of the next big events in Roman history is the conspiracy of Catiline. Now, I've actually already recorded an episode talking all about the Catiline conspiracy, so I won't go into any detail here, but just to mention what it is, one of the senators, Catiline, was accused of, whether it was rightly accused of or not, trying to lead an insurrection against Rome and installing himself as some sort of dictator or some sort of Sulla type figure, but it was quashed. It was found out and quashed by Crassus and Cicero. Cicero was the consul that year, and Catiline and his conspirators were ultimately defeated. But the point, and I'll go into the detail about that next time, but the point about it is that Crassus was implicated possibly as being behind it or having something to do with it, but we just don't know for sure. The sources don't tell us explicitly. Now, I want to switch the narrative over to a new character, Publius Clodius Pulcher. I shall just call him Clodius. His real name really was Claudius. He was from the Claudian family, the most eminent and revered, nearly, probably, of all Roman families. Some of the sources call him Pulcher all the time, but we'll call him Clodius. Now, this Clodius was quite a character, and he becomes really important. I won't give him his whole episode of Epochs, but he's a very important character and will crop up in the story of Pompey and Caesar and Cicero. So I want to talk about him here. So a little bit on Clodius's early life. When he was just coming of age, he was given a military position, as was the norm, sort of earn your stripes as a young man to do service in the forces. And he served under his brother-in-law, Lucullus. And Lucullus is also another character who won't get his own epochs, but is very important to the story and will crop up again and again all over the place. And Lucullus was one of the greatest generals of the time. He was up there with Pompey, with a sure pair of hands, a tried and tested, experienced military commander. And so the young Clodius served under him. But he caused an insurrection, some sort of insurrection in Lucullus's army, his own brother-in-law. Clodius, despite being extremely aristocratic, about as aristocratic as it comes, was a popularis, as I mentioned in some of the earlier Marius and Sulla ones. It wasn't necessarily the case that everyone rich and landed and aristocratic was certainly an optimat, and everyone that was poor or plebeian was a popularis. You had all sorts of crossovers. So anyway, Clodius was one of these blue bloods who was a popularis. Now, again, just like the Gracchi and other tribunes, whether that was real, out of real conviction, or whether it was just cynical in order to have an astronomical career very quickly, we don't know. It's probably the latter in the case of Clodius. But he said to Lucullus's troops, look, why do you keep fighting? There's just going to be endless wars, and at the end of it, the Senate's probably not going to give you the land they promised you. You're just going to fight and die, and it'll all be for nothing. And so, yeah, you know, what an ungrateful thing to do. He's given a military command as a young and up-and-coming officer, given all the privileges you could hope for, and what does he do? He goes and sows mutiny and insurrection among the men. So right off the bat, he's sort of quite a colourful person. And as I said, Lucullus was his brother-in-law, so Lucullus was married to his sister, Clodia, and he had more than one sister. And these sisters were known themselves as being socialites, to put it nicely, if I'm not going to be so kind, sort of wild women, promiscuous, outspoken, certainly not in the classic mould of an old-style Roman matron. These were sort of part of a new sect. And that's something to say. in Rome at this period, it'd been a few generations since Rome had become the dominant master of the Mediterranean world. So there's this new generation that had grown up rich and privileged and knew it and weren't abashed by it. And instead of having the sort of the old Roman virtues of being sort of self-denying and extremely strict, and that virtue was extremely important, they'd sort of abandoned a lot of that and just sort of wild and have massive drunken parties and, again, be promiscuous and all sorts of things. For example, 100 years or so before, it was certainly not the done thing for Romans, certainly not Roman women, to dance. You know, that's how sort of straight-laced they were. But now, this new set of Clodius and his sisters, they would have drunken parties and dance naked on tables. So you can see they're very deliberately flying in the face of the old values, like a counterculture. And Caesar himself was part of that set, this sort of new party set. You know, after World War I, there was this sort of counterculture. You know, had the idea of flappers and androgyny for the first time. Or after World War II, during the 50s, you might have sort of beatniks, the beat generation. Or in the 60s, the hippies. You know, androgyny, wearing your hair long like a girl. World War II generation thought they were very effeminate, the hippies, and very idle and subversive, and so on. And we see this in this generation, the generation of Clodius and Caesar, that they had a different sense of fashion. Caesar was a trendsetter. He sort of wore his toga very differently. He wore it very loosely. He'd wear a belt around his toga, but a very loose belt. It gets commented upon all the time, loosely belted. And he would have sleeves on his toga, which was kind of new. And they would have goatees. Usually, all good Romans, good old-fashioned Roman man, would be cleanly shaven. To have a beard, there's something very Greek about that, and thus effeminate. Only effeminate men would have beards. It's funny, isn't it? We think it the other way round, probably. But a good Roman would be cleanly shaven, whereas this new set would have goatees. That was one of their things, and loose togas with a loose belt. And Caesar had championed that sort of look when he was younger, as a young man. And people copied him. There was this whole caste in Rome that followed him. And they were all populares as well. So just to be clear, they're all populares. And this Clodius is part of that. Him and Caesar are perhaps the leading lights in this informal set, this counterculture. And then Clodius is involved in a great scandal, the scandal of the great goddess, or the Bona Dea affair. And what that was is that the Pontifex Maximus, the most important religious office in ancient Rome, every year his wife would conduct a special sort of ceremony in the house of the Pontifex Maximus with the Vestal Virgins and the mother of the Pontifex Maximus and all sorts of important religious women, just women though, exclusively women. It would be sacrilege if a man were there, and they would do all sorts of sacrifices and intone all sorts of things. And it was a religious ceremony. And on this one particular year, a servant girl in the corridors of the giant palatial house of the Pontifex Maximus came across a sort of an unknown woman hiding in the shadows in one of the corridors. And she sort of confronted her and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" And this woman said what she wanted. She just said, "Pompeia," which was the Pontifex Maximus's wife, the sort of the leader of this ceremony, this religious ceremony. But the woman's voice was unmistakably a man's voice. And so the servant woman sort of screamed and raised the alarm, and the special sacrifices that were going on were all brought to a sudden end, and the house was searched from top to bottom, and they found in the corner of one of the rooms, trying to hide, this man in drag who had asked to see the wife of the Pontifex Maximus, Pompeia. And when it was revealed the identity of this man in drag, who was completely sort of illegally even on the property, it turned out it was Clodius. It was Publius Clodius Pulcher. So he's a naughty boy. He's a black sheep of the family. He's sort of wild. He seems to do whatever he wants, kind of within reason. And of course the suggestion is that he was there to see Pompeia for some nefarious reason, perhaps for secret assignations, you know, a sexual or dangerous liaison perhaps, who knows, it never came to that of course. But the thing that made it so scandalous is that the Pontifex Maximus was Julius Caesar, so it's Caesar's wife. Claudius committed perhaps, possibly some argue, sacrilege and was trying to sleep with Caesar's wife behind his back. Now Caesar was a cheater and an extreme womanizer, but nonetheless this was a huge scandal. Apparently the word went around Rome extremely quickly, you know, within a day. Because Rome, in the 1st century BC, Rome wasn't a giant metropolis. Like, it was big, it was one of the biggest cities in the world, but it wasn't, you know, the size of London or New York or anything like that. It was still what we would consider a large town. So word can kind of go round in a day or two, even without newspapers. And it was just a giant scandal. And the Roman establishment, the people, the public opinion, they didn't even really know what to do. It was such an unprecedented thing. I mean, had any law even been broken? What do we do? So it was decided, the Senate decided, to call a type of inquest just to decide whether Claudius should go on trial or not. To give you an idea of how much of a scandal it was, Cicero wrote to one of his best friends in Greece, Atticus, talking about it. That's one of the great things about this period of Rome. We've got quite a lot of detail. Cassius Dio, Appian, Plutarch, Caesar himself, but lots of letters of Cicero, which give a great sort of behind the scenes look at things, if you like, because there was supposed to be a private correspondence. So it's not, you know, a formal speech or a formal history. It's someone actually kind of gossiping to their friend. And in one of the letters, Cicero said to Atticus, quote, "I imagine that you've heard that P. Claudius, the son of Appius, was caught dressed up as a woman in C. Caesar's house at the national sacrifice, and that he owes his escape alive to the hands of a servant girl. A spectacular scandal. I am sure you will be deeply distressed," end quote. That last line is obviously a bit sarcastic because, well, Cicero, you can kind of tell Cicero was in glee about it. Both Caesar and Claudius were enemies, actual full-blown political enemies of Cicero. So he's loving the scandal. But it's interesting that he writes to Atticus in Greece and says, "You've probably already heard." So that's how much of a big deal it was. And so at Claudius's inquest to see if he should go on trial formally, we see the way things are starting to go, because Claudius's friends, this fashionable crew, this new counterculture sect, they're there in force to support or in solidarity with their boy Claudius. And in Rome, as I've said before, there's no police force. At this stage, there's no Praetorian Guard, there's no army. Armed men are not allowed to cross the Pomerium. So public violence is a thing. If you've got a big group of men that are prepared to do violence, you can sway any sort of public gathering, any sort of public assembly. If you've got the will and the brass balls to do it, you can do it. And so Claudius's mob, his crew, turn out in force at this inquest. And Cicero wrote this, again, in a private correspondence. He said, quote, "When the day came for the bill to be put to the assembly under the terms of the senatorial decree, there was a flocking together of our goateed young bloods, the whole Catilinarian gang, with little Miss Curio at their head, to plead for its rejection. Claudius's roughs had taken possession of the gangways," end quote. So there's sort of this new power in Rome, if you like, Claudius's gang. And they can sort of quite literally, directly intimidate the assembly or the very forum itself, if they wanted to, needed to, into doing what they wanted. Now, this isn't entirely new in Rome, you know, going back to Tiberius Gracchus, or even going back to ancient times, you know, things like that had happened. But we move up into a new gear. We move into a time when it becomes a lot more common and a lot more organised and used much more ruthlessly, rather than just here or there, a bit haphazardly. It almost becomes standardised, because Claudius's friends aren't just there to sort of intimidate. They are there to assault and kill people if they need to. Just because they're fashionable, don't think of them as sort of modern day fashion victims who aren't violent people. No, these are also, at the same time, street thugs, prepared to do violence. At this inquest, to see if there's a trial, Caesar himself is called as a witness, and Caesar just says, I wasn't there, you know, as Pontifex Maximus, I wasn't allowed to be there. I wasn't there, I didn't see anything, I don't know what happened. Because, of course, Clodius and Caesar are political allies. They're in the same, they move in the same circles, they're in the same set, they're both popularis. So Caesar's in a difficult spot here, really, because he doesn't want to throw Clodius under the bus, but he can't be seen to be defending what he did. And in the meantime, Caesar had divorced his wife. Even the whiff of scandal was enough to make him divorce his wife. And under cross-examination, he was asked, well, if you didn't see anything, and you don't necessarily think anything untoward was done, why did you divorce your wife then? Explain that. And Caesar said, very famous line, isn't it? Because Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. But it does look like that Clodius, it's a bit of a slam dunk, he was sort of obviously there. His alibi was that he wasn't even in the city, which is a silly alibi. Of course he was. There's multiple witnesses, and he's going to have to go to trial and almost certainly be found guilty of something. And, you know, may end up being exiled or even executed, who knows what. But then Cicero takes the stand. Now, Cicero had been consul the previous year, but he didn't have any reason to get involved in this, other than he just hated Clodius, and his wife hated Clodius's wife. And so he stuck his oar in and gave evidence against Clodius, hopefully just to take this thing across the line and make sure one of his political enemies was destroyed. But Clodius was acquitted, found innocent of any wrongdoing, and therefore no need for a trial. But now Clodius will never forget what Cicero did there, or tried to do, tried to sink him. And so where they were already political enemies, now they're sort of fairly deadly political enemies. Well, deadly from Clodius's side. Cicero doesn't command any kind of gang. It's one of the biggest political mistakes Cicero made, really, in hindsight. One great little story is that effectively what was the jury to decide in this inquest, just before they gave their verdict, they asked for protection. They asked for some sort of close protection from the mob before they gave their verdict, and they were granted it. But then when they returned an innocent verdict, one of the most eminent men of the time, Catullus, said to them, why did you ask for, you know, close protection? Were you afraid you were going to be robbed of your bribes? Which is, you know, funny, revealing thing to have said. So Clodius is set free at this point, and he's got an axe to grind now. He was already, you know, something of a wild man, prepared to throw caution to the wind, and with this sort of mob at his beck and call, he's now going to dial it up, way up. And this is the point where Caesar, as proconsul, goes off to Spain. I mentioned in the last episode he had to borrow a load of money, well over 800 talents, from Crassus in order to pay off some of his debtors in order to go to Spain. And it's also about this time that Pompey returns from the east. Now, Pompey had been away fighting the pirates, and I'll talk all about this in detail. Everything I'm about to say I'll talk about in good detail when I do my episode on Pompey, but very quickly, the Mediterranean had been infested with pirates for a long time, and they'd been causing all sorts of havoc with shipping, particularly grain shipments from Egypt across to Italy and Rome, which Rome required badly in order to not starve. The pirates had been disrupting that and all sorts of commerce, to such a point where the state had sent Pompey the Great to go and deal with it. And he sort of swept the whole Mediterranean with boats to get rid of nearly all the pirates. And he did it successively. But then also around the same time, in the same part of his career, he conquered loads of the east. He went and finished off Mithridates. You remember Sulla was fighting Mithridates. There'd been 3 Mithridatic wars, and this was the 3rd and final one. Lucullus had actually done quite a lot of all the work on that. And Pompey came along and finished it up, mopped it up. Mithridates finally commits suicide by poison, the Poison King. And so Pompey basically conquered, I'll put a map up, Cappadocia, Pontus, Syria, ancient Syria, which isn't the same as modern Syria, but a vast swathe, Palestine, done a deal with Egypt, vast swathes of the east Pompey conquered, setting up new countries, setting up new kings. setting up a whole new system of administration and empire in the East, making them all his clients. Rome had this system of clients, you know, where the men under you owed you fealty and gave you money, and you gave them protection, a bit like mobsters, really. Well, Pompey was making clients of kings. And so he comes back to Rome, a spectacular 2-day triumph, one of the greatest triumphal processions ever, and he's just simply the greatest living general of the day, by some way. A legend, a living legend. And he comes back to Rome, and after his triumph, he says to the Senate, of which Cato the Younger, is one of the leading lights. He says to the Senate, I want you to legally give me lots of land so I can give that to the soldiers. You know, that's the deal. That's been the deal ever since the days of Marius. So, you know, we have to do that because, you know, that's a promise. My honour is on the line, and it's just a done thing. That's what we've been doing for a couple of generations here now. So if you can just sort of legally give me all these plots of land for the men, you know, it's the right thing to do. It's the only thing to do, really. And the Senate saying, no, no deal. So that's crazy. That's terrible. That sort of cut Pompey in half, you know. Pompey also says, oh, well, also I've done loads of deals out in the East, set up loads of infrastructure and put in place lots and lots of different types of, done all sorts of statesmanship out in the East, which I need you to rubber stamp. So, you know, so it's all sort of formalised. And they say no deal to that as well, no. So again, Pompey's gone from the greatest man in the world, the greatest statesman, to just being completely undermined by the Senate. And the reason they did that, or the reason why, you know, Cato did that, and I'll talk all about this in fantastic detail in my episode about Cato, is that they just feared Pompey was becoming overly powerful. He was becoming too great. If they weren't careful, he would make himself a new Marius or a new Sulla. He would be, even if he doesn't sort of have prescriptions, he would just de facto be a type of unnamed king of Rome. And they don't want that. All sorts of people within the Optimate faction, and Cato and Cicero, they don't want anyone to be that powerful. We all know that Pompey didn't even really want that. When he returned to Rome, he could have returned to Rome with an army if he'd wanted to. There's literally nothing in the laws of physics stopping him from doing that. But he disbanded his army and left his army outside Rome. So Pompey certainly wasn't a Sulla type figure. But nonetheless, they sort of quite badly screw him over. There's a great sort of scene in the life of Pompey by Plutarch where he's just had his triumph, you know, where it's such a great thing that you have to keep being reminded you're only a mortal man and not a god. And he's gone from that, the highest height, to being completely undermined and humiliated, really, well, definitely humiliated by the Senate. And after that, just sitting down quietly by himself, sort of just staring at the floor, fiddling with the hem of his toga in a stunned silence. It's a bit sad, really. But nonetheless, despite all of that, he is still obviously one of, if not really still, the preeminent man in Rome, Pompey. Caesar's military career is only really beginning at this point. He hasn't gone to Gaul or anything yet. He's building his military CV out in Spain right now. So the other main rival, political opponent in Rome is Crassus. They're the two sort of leading men. Crassus is the richest, most influential man, and Pompey is the greatest military commander by some distance. And so they share a consulship where, as I told you, they got nothing done because they kept quarrelling with each other. Here's a line from Appian about some of that. This is what Caesar did before he'd left for Spain, this is.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.